Okay, so it's Helen here from Yorkshire Talks, and we're doing a series of chats with interesting people around what their story, what's their why. The purpose of doing these chats is to share tips, hints to try and help people cope in this lockdown period. And today I'm really happy to chat to Ian Thompson, who is a designer and filmmaker. And we met Ian just after we came back from our row, and Thompson Brand very kindly designed us a website. And just at that point, when I met Ian, I knew he was somebody quite special, because he was very, very excited because he just completed his film, which has an amazing title called Northern Souls, a film about men who dance. And you were so excited when you'd actually done it, and I actually watched a clip of it, and I actually got goosebumps when I watched it. It was really powerful. And the reason also I wanted to speak to Ian is because Ian followed his dream, because he said, this is what I want to do. So over to you, Ian. So what's your story?
All right, my story. Okay, well, I was born in Hare Hills in Leeds, the second of 5 children, and we had no money. So it's quite a poor family. Not that it mattered really, because we were very loved by our parents, who were younger parents. Whenever I was at school, all the other kids had parents that were more like my grandma and granddad, and they were very young. So I went to I went to a school called Brownhill, that's not there anymore, which was a big old Victorian school. There were lots of those in Leeds. And then we moved to Seacroft, which looked as though it was going to be nicer, but it was actually a lot worse. And I went to a very rough school called Foxwood. I begged my mum and dad to let me go there. I passed my 11 plus, and I was supposed to go to a school called Central High Grammar School in central Leeds, and I took one look at it and thought, that's not for me. And I begged mum and dad to let me go where all my mates were going in Foxwood. It wasn't a great idea. It was a dodgy school. But what I realised early on is I enjoyed art, and I was good at art. And I thought, well, I'll make a career out of it. And eventually went to do a foundation course at the then college that was called Jacob Kramer in Leeds. And then
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah. And then a degree at Leeds Poly. I decided to become a designer, which I was kind of encouraged to do that by the tutor. I thought I was going to be an illustrator, but he said to me, he gave me some really good advice. In fact, he asked me a question. He said, do you like working with other people, or do you like working on your own? And I said, well, I'd rather work with other people. So he said, right, you better be a designer, because illustrators just sit on their own all day. And I thought, oh, right, it's good advice, that. So I did a few jobs in television, actually, first, bizarrely. I worked for a TV graphic designer for 50 quid a week, which he never paid me on time. He paid me like every 2 weeks. I was skint. And I did.
That's character building.
Yeah, well, I wasn't really that bothered. I didn't need much money at the time. I was living in a place called the Faversham. It was a pub.
Oh, I know the Faversham. I used to go there when I was about 18.
Exactly, and it used to be a hotel actually for like, the entertainment industry, and I knew the people who lived there and who owned it, and I ended up living in the Faversham.
Did you?
Yeah, whichever. Used to look through the register for whichever hotel rooms were empty, and I'd go and eventually I got my own hotel room, and I lived there throughout my whole student years. It was crazy.
Yeah, it was a great
place to live. Yeah, and that's where I met my wife, Kath, who was doing a psychology degree. She was actually very academic. She'd been to a place called the Atlantic College in Wales, which was full of very bright people. And she came to Leeds to do psychology and flunked it. She just decided she didn't want to do it. And she was a bar manageress, and I met her there, and eventually got married in 1984, August the 11th. And the Monday after the weekend we got married, I started a business. I started a design business, really, because there was absolutely no design scene at all in Leeds. There were a few big agencies that I didn't like the look of. They all seemed like old people to me. And so I set up this company and messed about for a few years. It did reasonably well. And then I got serious in the 90s. I wanted to become a branding agency. But the truth is, really, from 1989, my story was really about my wife and my kids. My first son, Luke, was born in 1989. And from that day forward, the goal for me was to get home, because the reality was that due to the nature of what I did, which is very skills orientated and very focused on my skills, I worked late hours for a long time. I never worked a weekend. I always said I would never work a weekend. I didn't. That was for Kath and the kids. But I did work late, and I always felt really bad about it. So from then on, really, it was just a plan to get home. We then had 2 other children, and I realised in order to get home, I'd need to build a proper, decent-sized business that could function without me. Which did work.
What a great strategy to kind of inside.
It is, except it took 35 years to pull off.
Yeah, but
it took 35 years to achieve.
But it's a very well respected agency, isn't it? That's what I.
Yeah, I think by now we've got to that point. I was very pleased. I mean, obviously it wasn't my only motivation. I wanted to build a decent business.
Yeah.
As well, and a business that had values, and a business that had value to the world, and so there were always these sort of 2 things going on.
What's your why, Ian? What do you think?
Oh, it's very clear. It's very clear. There was a headmaster in my primary school at Ascot Hill, Mr. Walker, fantastic guy. And it was a lovely school, actually. It was in Seacroft, but it was a wonderful school, very well run, lovely teachers. And he used to speak to us in assembly. And he talked to us all about talent. And I always really listened to these things and really took them in and believed everything that was said to me. And he said, you must find your talent, and it's your solemn duty to use what you've got to the best of your ability, and to use it for good, to use to benefit society. And
he was so ahead of his time, wasn't he?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there was a lot of talk like that in those days. I mean, it was actually quite a moral time. I mean, you've got to remember this is all pre 1980s. I think of myself as a 70s person, and the reality is that people from that decade had not yet been exposed to the notion of, not greed is good, because that's not really the right thing, but, I think post-80s, it was fill your boots.
Yes.
You haven't done the job right unless you've filled your coffers, I mean, the measure of success is how much money you've got, and, there was no talk about that in the 70s. And so, just to finish that point very briefly, I decided, as soon as I became a designer, it's very crystal clear to me, was the 2 things that I thought were wrong with a lot of areas that I felt I could improve was things are too complicated. Life is too complicated. And I went, design can make things simpler and clearer. The other thing is things are too boring. There's no need for things to be boring. Why not just be better and exciting? And it's very clear to me. So make things simpler and clearer, and make them more interesting. Excellent. And that was it. That's the why. And that's what I try and do. That's what I've always tried to do.
So you now have sold your business and you're now focusing and you're following your dream on being a maker, which is amazing. And you're also mentoring businesses, design businesses.
Yeah.
So what are you telling them? What are you advising them at the moment in relation to this new normal and how the new world will look and how design agencies will need to change?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, most of the stuff that we deal with is practical, actually. There's very rarely an opportunity to kind of be philosophical about what to do. Most businesses, and certainly design businesses, which are invariably small, have just got day-to-day problems to deal with. And actually, I really focus on the practical because I've had mentors in the past who like to kind of swan in and pontificate about grand philosophical theories, charge you a fortune, and wander off and say the same things to everybody else. Really, most of what you need as a small service business is things like how do you make sure that when you're recruiting that the staff are going to be compatible with what you're doing? Mm-hmm. What the hell do you do when you have a coronavirus like this? When's the right time to furlough?
Yeah.
How do you make sure that when you furlough, that you don't end up with a load of work that you can't cope with? You know, and so a lot of it is really practical. Fortunately, you know, the businesses that I'm dealing with are kind of doing okay. You know, they're quite healthy businesses. One of them particularly is doing extremely well. But actually, my ex-business, Thompson, they're having a difficult time because I got that business up to kind of 20-odd people, and several of them have had to be furloughed. Obviously, you know, we are really vulnerable, I think, in this kind of industry because, you know, we've always been a service that people imagine they can do without, and in some cases they can. So whenever times are tough, whether it be this situation or even in a kind of fairly minor financial recession, we're the first ones to drop off the cliff.
Yeah.
It's always my desire to get my business in the same position as, say, accountants and solicitors, which are seen as just being necessary services to the running of a business. But, you know, that's kind of lifelong task. So in terms of what I'm telling them in a big sense, not a lot really. Most of what I talk to them about is really sticking to your focus. Decide what kind of business you are first and really try and follow that path because there are so many distractions, so many other things that will take you away from that. And decide what you believe in and what your values are and what difference you want to make to the world, because actually it's easier to run a business when you've always got a clarion call that brings you back to the central purpose of why you're doing it, because everything about business is there to distract you from that. So that's the kind of thing I tell them.
Okay, and I just want